said that you never forget how to ride a bike. It's muscle memory, a long-term unconscious action that one can recollect with no direct awareness. But does the same logic apply to Formula 1? Can you forget how to drive an F1 car? More to the point, can you forget how to drive one quickly? The history books will certainly say that it's a possibility. Scattered across those pages are numerous drivers who have shone brightly, sprayed champagne, hoisted titles aloft, only for things to go downhill faster than an international cheese rolling tournament. The natural speed slows, the wins become increasingly minor placings, before it all comes to a crunching crescendo, and this once wunderkind leaves the sport a mere shadow of the figure who once came soaring into it. Have I mentioned we're discussing 1997 world champion Jacques Villeneuve today? Most of a modern generation of F1 viewers will know him as one of many random bodies to regularly surface on a TV broadcast, spouting opinions thankfully better than that of certain other individuals. Not many fans of my age, hello fellow 90s kids, would have seen much, if any, of his driving exploits. And those that did, like me, would have only caught a glimpse of a man at the very tail end of his career. Based on what we saw on track, it would have been easily lost that here was a man who was nearly a race winner on his debut, nearly world champion the same season, who took on and beat Michael Schumacher to the title the very next year in dramatic circumstances. In just 2 years, he'd won a third of all his races, scored 13 pole positions, and only he and a certain Lewis Hamilton had claimed a world title so soon after their debut. Like his locks, the future looked golden for both him and F1 fans. They'd been cruelly denied the mythical premise of a Senna-Schumacher rivalry, and had nibbled only the tiniest morsel of a Hill and Schumacher conflict. At the end of 1997, the stage was set for a Schumacher versus Villeneuve era to begin. Across the next 9 years, Schumacher won 64 Grand Prix and 5 World Championships. Titles were duelled for with the likes of Mika Häkkinen, Kimi Räikkönen, Juan Pablo Montoya and Fernando Alonso. But no Jacques Villeneuve. The Canadian's record within the same time frame read 132 race entries and a resounding 0 in the win column, never mind the consideration of another world title. His only minor achievements were 4 podiums and a handful of points, before his tale came to a less than satisfying conclusion in the middle of 2006, his reputation long since bruised, battered and broken. What is often missed in the final chapters of the Villeneuve vignette was a brief sojourn with Rising Force's Renault at the tail end of 2004. This was a Renault on the cusp of greatness, with back-to-back world championships shortly about to head to those Enstone headquarters in the arms of Alonso, who, discounting the all-dominant Ferraris of the year, had one of the fastest cars in the field. After 6 years of mediocre machinery, and with another 2 to shortly follow on, this had all the hallmarks of one final hurrah for one of history's more maligned F1 champions, a shot at one last spray of champagne on the podium, a showcase of some old-fashioned swashbuckling overtakes, and an opportunity to take revenge on those who had wronged him in the past. The reality was anything but, and now regularly occupies the briefest of footnotes in the many biographies of Jacques. What turned Villeneuve's Renault Redemption arc to a pile of Renault regrets? Let's find out. Having established how quickly Villeneuve had conquered the world, it is perhaps useful for us to gain a sense of perspective on just how quickly it all began to fall away from him. Like Hamilton, he had soared to the front of the field, ejected a world champion from his team, and thwarted a Ferrari title challenge the next year. And like Lewis, his title defence was blunted by uncompetitive machinery. In the Canadians' case, this was owing to the departure of engine partners Renault from his Williams outfit. Mechachrome, they of the questionable F2 engines, took over development and promptly delivered an underpowered chunk of an engine. Coupled with an inferior set of Goodyear tyres, Williams toppled down the order to a distant third fastest. Championships, wins and poles soon became a distant memory. Villeneuve started on the front row just once all year, scraped onto the podium only twice, led precisely 0 laps, and wound up 5th in the Drivers' Championship. At year's start, Williams' Patrick Head had proclaimed, "The general view is that Villeneuve's not in Schumacher's class. He wants to put that right." As the year went on, it was clear that if that was the case, then Williams was not where Jacques needed to be to accomplish that, with more of the same results anticipated in 1999. Rumours swirled over links to Ferrari, and McLaren's Adrian Newey supposedly lobbied for Jacques to join him there. But in one of the sport's most infamous moves, Jacques instead wound up at the new British-American racing outfit. Whilst nowhere near as established as the other leading names, there was plenty reason to be excited over the project. It was well funded through British American Tobacco and had the technical expertise of leading race car manufacturer Renault, who boasted an enviable record of conquering every racing category they'd ever touched. And from 2000 onwards, Honda, so dominant in F1's past with the likes of McLaren and Williams, would be jumping on board too. Add to all this the fact that this was a team clearly centred around its lead driver, with Jacques' manager and good friend Craig Pollock at the helm, and with a subservient number 2 in rookie Ricardo Zonta in the other car. The likes of Pollock and other higher-ups claimed they would win their first ever race. On face value, it wasn't the most outrageous statement. The BAR blues of Jacques Villeneuve is enough of a saga that warrants its own video, but suffice to say it was not a successful partnership. The 99 debut of BAR remains one of, if not the, biggest flops in F1 history. For all those pre-season boasts, BAR ended the year bottom of the constructors' table, the only outfit to fail to score a point all year. By the next year they had finally risen from those ashes to become somewhat regular point scorers, but were still stubbornly short of the high-flying potential Jacques had been sold on. Rumours circulated that Benetton's soon-to-be Renault had put in an offer for his services, and that once again the likes of McLaren or Ferrari might be looking in his direction. But JV stayed put, to the bafflement of all. Maybe he sincerely believed in the project. Maybe he felt that lifting a team from the bottom to the top would rank him above Schumacher's efforts in waking the sleeping giant of Ferrari. Or maybe he was quite content to keep receiving enormous paychecks as the second highest paid driver on the grid. Whatever the reason, it would prove to be the wrong one. Year after year, the promises of "this time we'll get it right" became so oft repeated that they lost what little meaning they possessed. Steps weren't taken forward, but to the side, if not backwards. From 7th in the 2001 drivers' table, Villeneuve slipped to 12th the next year and plummeted to 16th the year after that. Just as there had been little doubt that Jacques would jump ship to BAR for 99, there was equally no doubt that he would be on his way out for 2004. The catch was that it wasn't his choice. At the end of 2001, Pollock had departed BAR and former Benetton current ProDrive chairman David Richards came in. He and Villeneuve saw matters about as eye-to-eye as Schwarzenegger and DeVito, as showcased mere moments after Richard had parked himself behind his new office desk when he declared the money for Villeneuve's salary would be better spent on car development. Whilst his words might seem harsh, they only mimicked those up and down the paddock. For results had not been the only thing in decline during his time at BAR, but his once hallowed reputation had steadily begun to wane too. Even after that horrendous 99 debacle, Jacques was still highly rated by managers and media alike. Nigel Roebuck declared his year a criminal waste of one of the great talents, and Andrew Benson chipped in to praise his manic determination and huge confidence. At this point in time, Villeneuve was merely a victim. If anything, his reputation only grew, as people pondered just what this talent might be able to do in machinery to match. But then the results continued not to come. He found himself being matched, if not beaten, by newer teammates like Olivier Panis and Jenson Button. Opinions started to shift. maybe BAR's lack of progress was partly located in one of their cockpits. By the end of 2001, people were beginning to notice a loss of spark from the Canadian. 2 years later, he had been comfortably outshone by Button, in part due to some woeful reliability on the Canadian's part, but the fact was that when the car did keep ticking along, he was extracting performances described as tepid at best. The once hard charger was now seen as yesterday's hero. His ill-fated decision to join and stick with the BAR project had horrendously backfired. None were particularly shocked when on the 4th of October 2003, his exit from BAR was officially confirmed. What did get eyebrows raising though was the fact that 5 days later, the day before Friday practice at the season finale in Japan, Villeneuve pulled out of his final Grand Prix appearance with BAR, stating that his heart was simply not in it. "Why should I go out and risk my life for someone I do not respect, someone I don't want to be near," grumbled Jacques, in the approximate direction of his old boss. As champions' exits go, it had a touch of the 95 Mansell or the 99 Hill to it, in that it was messy, inglorious, and far from fitting of a man who had once conquered the world. Unlike those with bushier moustaches and or eyebrows though, Jacques had no intention of this being the end of his story. "I still enjoy racing," he said, "and I would like to keep doing it." Trouble was, where? For not only had Villeneuve's results and subsequent reputation been in a steady decline, but his market options had gradually wilted within the same time frame too. Long gone were the days when the likes of a Ferrari or a McLaren were sniffing about to poach the former champ. 6 years on from his world title triumph, the once hottest shot in town had seen his stock fall so low that not even F1 Supremo Bernie Ecclestone could convince potential suitors in Jaguar or Toyota to give Villeneuve the time of day, allegedly even attempting to offer the Canadian services for free in one last-ditch attempt to save his skin. "I did everything possible to talk teams into giving Jacques a drive for next season," said Bernie, "but the truth is, no one wants him." So Villeneuve was forced to turn his attention to a comeback in 2005. Despite this backdrop of negativity, there were still some who believed in the Canadian. "Jacques was as good as any we've ever had," reflected Frank Williams. "No matter how good he is, a driver is always coloured by his car. Put Schumacher in a Minardi, he might only move up the grid a few rows. Give Jacques a better car, and I'm sure he'll do better." Eddie Jordan chimed in with his 2 cents, declaring Villeneuve a big team kind of performer who'd slot in well somewhere like Ferrari. Ecclestone concurred, suggesting that he had previously tried to orchestrate a move to the prancing horse for Jacques. It didn't come off because Michael insists on number 1 status. It shows he must still consider Jacques a threat. And so it was that despite the deafening silence from potential suitors at the end of 2003, there was a genuine belief JV might be back on the grid for 2005 and in a much better position than when he left it. Carpentry aficionados, get ready for a showcase in mending broken bridges, because Jacques was not only targeting a top spot in F1, but a shot at redemption with some old friends. Williams had at least one vacant seat going, with Montoya departing for McLaren, and a likely second one too, providing Ralf Schumacher moved across to Toyota as most were anticipating. The list of potential replacements contained just about every name a mid-2000s F1 fan could muster, from Mark Webber and David Coulthard to the more outlandish suggestions like Anthony Davidson or IndyCar's Scott Dixon. And somewhere in the middle on that spectrum was their last world champion. Jacques held discussions with technical director Head, and Sir Frank mooted a potential summertime test. "I want to get back into F1 and fight at the front," insisted Jacques. "I'm hungry for a return." But it seems Williams didn't share that same appetite. At the end of July, Webber had been confirmed in one of those Williams seats, and a week after that, Villeneuve's old BAR stablemate Button announced that he would be jumping ship across too, though not without triggering a messy dispute between his old and new team over just who would retain his services for 2005, a wrangle that went all the way to F1's contract recognition board. With another seat now available, it didn't take long for Jacques to begin speculation over a return to the team where things had split so acrimoniously a few months prior, declaring it, like that Michael Schumacher video I promised to make about 2 years ago, unfinished business. David Richards and I have had our differences, but I believe we can put everything behind us. And seemingly so did Richards, who confirmed talks had taken place, but wanted to resolve the Great Button quarrel first before opening discussions with any other driver. But neither spot went to Jacques. Button would stay with BAR, closing off that avenue there, whilst Williams, in part thanks to some BMW-branded peer pressure, plucked for Nick Heidfeld for their second seat. Other inquiries for options towards the front of the field went little better. He attempted to crowbar himself into McLaren within a test driver capacity, and was met with a sign that plainly read, "No Villeneuves." When other racing series, namely those of an American variety, refused to give him the time of day, it was clear that much as he and others might believe it, an offer for a competitive seat just wasn't coming. If he wanted to go racing again, then alternative arrangements needed to be made. Glances were made further down the pecking order to locate any available teams seeking a former world champion, and lo and behold there were. Nearly a year on from his infamous BAR bye-bye, on Wednesday the 15th of September 2004, Villeneuve signed a 2-year contract with perennially invisible midfielders Sauber. After years of threatening that things will get better, it seemed Villeneuve had now belatedly accepted his time at the front of an F1 field was over, that hopes of one last hurrah were extinguished for good. But then the door to redemption creaked open, just a crack. Following their withdrawal at the end of 1997, Renault had since returned to F1 in 2002. This time it was as a full-scale works operation, their first such attempt since 1985, having bought out Benetton in March of 2000. The team that had delivered Schumacher his first world titles had been on a steady decline after the German's departure, but Renault soon set about righting their new ship. In their first year, the team leapt from backmarkers to regular point scorers, and by their second, they were race winners once more. And that steady rate of improvement was only building. After back-to-back fourth-place finishes in the Constructors, they were now contenders for the silver medal position in the 2004 edition. Trouble was, that challenge was quickly running out of steam, as Renault had contracted a case of Red Bull-itis. It's an illness modern fans are only too painfully aware of, with the symptoms of one driver scoring their lion's share of points and being generally excellent, whilst the other driver isn't doing that. The latter-day Sonoda Perez of this instance was one Jarno Trulli. Not that you would have known it from the start of the year. It was the Italian's third season with Renault and one that had started very brightly. At the 6th race of the season, Monaco, Trulli had become the first driver to topple Schumacher from his seemingly obligatory place at the top step of the podium, as he took pole and then held off a chasing Button for a thrilling maiden win. By the midpoint of the season, he was a career-high 4th in the championship, just 3 points shy of Jensen in the hunt for 3rd. But from those fantastic heights, it had all started to go wrong. At the team's home Grand Prix in France, a disastrous last lap, last corner error dropped him from 3rd to 4th. The result was not just egg on the face, but leaving Renault head honchos Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons like two rabbits of a negative euphoria. Not happy bunnies. Matters did not improve. At Silverstone, Jarno suffered an enormous 170-mile-an-hour accident when the rear suspension failed. It irreversibly shook his faith in the car and the team. From this point on, he would regularly bemoan the lack of support he was receiving and insist that his car was no longer the equivalent of teammate Alonso's. It was a notion rebuffed by Briatore, who, in a rare sensible moment from the man, asked why the team would do this whilst fighting for their lives in the Constructors. "I think he's suffering from a syndrome," Flavio declared. Whatever the truth, the result was that even despite a well-timed pole position at Spa, a run of 5 races in a row without points. With driver and boss now no longer on speaking terms, you would have thought the Chamber of Secrets had been opened, given how clear it was that the writing was on the wall. When Jarno confirmed he'd be leaving Renault for 2005, The question was how early and not if he would be dumped, and who might fancy stepping in for a spin. Briatore had already hired fellow Italian Giancarlo Fisichella as Trulli's replacement for the next year, and his first port of call was attempting to extract that Fizzy fella from his Sauber contract early, with Villeneuve replacing him there, giving both parties time to settle in at their new homes. But Sauber refused, and so Flavio turned his eyes to a more straightforward option, reserve driver Franck Montagny. Aside from possessing the most regularly butchered name in content creation, the Frenchman had been pounding the testing circuits throughout all of 2004, to the tune just under 13,000 miles, second only in those statistics to Ferrari's dependable test donkey Luc Badoer. Everything was set, recalled Franck. I was sure to get in the car. I had a lot of mileage in the car, it's a French guy with a French team, nothing to lose. But anytime a seat in F1 looks like opening up, let alone one at the front of the pack, a team principal will be inundated with calls from drivers and managers attempting to shoehorn their way into that seat, and Villeneuve was no different. He recounts, while I was in discussion with Sauber, I got a call from a friend who said, give a ring to Flavio, because Trulli's getting the sack. He did so, only to be swiftly rebuffed, with Flavio insisting they'd be putting Montagny in the car. So back into his contacts dived Jacques, this time calling Renault's chief executive Patrick Faure. Within an hour, a disgruntled Briatore phoned Villeneuve back, inviting him for a seat fitting that same day. On the Tuesday after the Italian Grand Prix, Renault announced Villeneuve would be testing with them at Silverstone across the next 2 days. Briatore strongly hinted that the test could well lead to Jacques joining the team for the final part of the season, a prospect that seemed even more likely when, within mere hours of this announcement, it was confirmed that Trulli was leaving Renault with immediate effect. Though it's not wholly relevant to our story, I don't think I can skip past this point without quickly sharing just how overly dramatic the two Italians responded to this news. Jarno described the situation as like two divorcees living in the same house, whilst Flavio went for the most soap opera adjacent quote I might ever have heard. I feel sorry, but we're done with him. There's no use going on and hurting each other. From the streets of Albert Square, let's pivot back to Silverstone. Out of not just F1 but racing cars in general for the past 11 months, it wasn't surprising to see Jacques prop up the bottom of the timesheets as he settled back into the rhythms of F1, though he was just a second shy of Alonso in the other Renault. Sufficiently warmed up, he promptly went third fastest the next day, mere hundredths from going fastest of all, and nearly 2 seconds clear of Montagny, though the Frenchman has since claimed the two were on very different programs that day. Regardless, Jacques was feeling good speed-wise and fitness-wise. I was able to attack in the car, and I am pleased with the time we set. Silverstone is one of the most physical tracks, so if I was okay here for 2 days, 130 laps, then there should be no problems. The next day, the news came through. Jacques Villeneuve, more like Comebacks Villeneuve, because the paddock's worst-kept secret was finally confirmed. The 97 champ would be racing for Renault for the final 3 rounds of the year: China, Japan and Brazil. Briatore decreed Jacques was full of enthusiasm, fit and resolute, and confidently proclaimed that fans would see him at the top level straight away. He'll motivate the team, motivate Fernando, said Flavio. If you tell me tomorrow what he's doing on Sunday, he will make the car finish in the points. Jacques too was backing himself to be on the pace and delivering from the get-go. I'm here to enjoy myself, but the priority is to contribute to Renault's fight in the championship. The team and I share a common goal: to beat BAR to second place. Not only did this dish offer the sweet taste of a return to race-winning machinery, but just to give it a little bit more spice, there was the secondary subplot, a story of not just redemption, but of revenge. After years of stagnation, it seemed that BAR had finally gotten things right in 2004. Across Villeneuve's 5 years with BAR, they had cracked the top 4 in qualifying on one solitary occasion. In 2004, Button and new teammate Takuma Sato had done so on 14 occasions, including the team's first pole position. From 83 previous attempts, they had scored just a lonely pair of podiums, both of which had arguably been earned through the misfortune of others than on merit. In the following 15 races since, they'd scored 9. If you're anyone other than Jacques Villeneuve and you want to see the most damning statistic to illustrate that jump in performance, operating under F1's traditional top 6 point system, BAR would have scored 53 points in half a decade, and then 73 in just 1 year. With Ferrari a country mile down the road and regular contenders McLaren and Williams floundering from the start of the year, both BAR and Renault had slotted into contention for the silver medal slot in the constructors' table. The French outfit had held the advantage for much of the year, but as Trulli's performances began to drop post Magny-Cours, so too did the points difference between the two. What had been a 17-point gap had gradually been chipped away at by the chasing tobacco advertisement boards. By Italy, Trulli's final Renault outing, the combination of a spinning Alonso and a 3-4 finish for Button and Sato had seen BAR jump ahead, but by a mere 3 points. It was still anyone's game, and who could be better motivated to put one over on Richards & Co. than the one who had been wronged by them just 12 months previously? It would be fun to beat BAR, said Jacques. It would be great, just because of the way it ended. For all the hyperbole though, it was a difficult return to a Grand Prix weekend. It was everyone's first time at the now well-established Shanghai circuit, which on one hand levelled the playing field somewhat for Jacques, but on the other it meant he had to contend with learning not just his new car, but a whole new circuit. Though he'd lapped within 3/10 of Alonso in both of Friday's practice sessions, spins and trips off track meant he failed to crack the top 10 in either. Things seemed to be on the up when he breached the top half in third practice and went faster still in qualifying, beating his previous best effort by nearly a second and telling the media that there were still a few more tenths to be found. It was just a shame they hadn't been located by this point, as the 4/10 gap to Alonso proved to be small in time but large in positional difference. Aided by 2004's cars, some of F1's fastest ever, the gap between those in the leading pack and the midfield had become increasingly tighter. For comparison's sake, at the previous year's Malaysian Grand Prix, a rough equivalent in terms of track length, a 4/10 deficit would have meant starting the row behind, but on this occasion there were 6 cars between the two Renaults, and Villeneuve's racing return would start from unlucky grid slot number 13. But with Sato starting towards the back of the pack with an engine penalty, which in turn bumped Jacques 1 place higher, and Alonso in close proximity to Button, the target was clear. If Villeneuve could get one over on the man who replaced him, and Alonso could beat Button, the constructors' pendulum would swing back in favour of Renault. That was something very achievable when you consider just how excellent the 2004 Renault package had been at the start of Grand Prix, routinely making up several places before even reaching the first corner. It looks like a video game every time you watch it on TV, Jacques joked. I just hope I won't be shocked too much. The lights went out, Villeneuve vaulted from 12th to 9th, dropped back to 11th, and then that was basically it. Race rustiness proved his Achilles heel, and in his own words, it took too long to get into his rhythm, too long to get his tyres working correctly. Whilst he decreed it all a good learning experience, the fact was it was Renault's joint worst result of the year, and though Alonso had picked up a healthy scoop of points in 4th, the BAR pair had come home in 2nd and 6th, widening the gap in the constructors' clash to 9 points. Messrs Briatore and Simmons pointed fingers at the car, stating simply, "We weren't quick enough today." Yet there was no shortage of praise for the job their new recruit had done, with Simmons decreeing his race had been near perfect. He had settled in by the end. I'm sure he can pose a threat in Suzuka. Even Alonso chimed in to claim that his new stablemate deserved a 10 for his performance. To be fair to Fernando though, he never specified whether that was out of 10 or 100. Social niceties aside, there was a genuine confidence that now Jacques had a full weekend's mileage under his belt, the competitiveness would come along. And doubly so now that he was heading to 2 circuits he not only knew well, but how to be successful at, having been a 2-time pole sitter in Japan and a winner in Brazil. There would be no faffing about in learning a new circuit, just knuckling in from the off and tweaking the car to his liking. At Suzuka, that was a particularly important factor, as Jacques eloquently puts it in his preview notes. You have a lot of delicate moments around the lap when the car has lots of downforce at high speed and you are turning and braking at the same time. The car needs to be very stable to really feel confident. If we can get the handling right, I'm sure we can score points. Time in the car on a familiar circuit was what he needed, and precisely what he didn't get. It was unclear just which deity Jacques had peed off on this occasion, other than one with a penchant for heavy rain. For who should rock to the circuit but Typhoon Ma-on, who washed out the entirety of Saturday running, meaning 2 practice sessions were cancelled and qualifying was shunted forward to Sunday morning before the Grand Prix. Despite just 13 laps worth of practice in various states of dampness, and being amongst the first to head out for qualifying, Villeneuve did an exceptional job to qualify 9th ahead of Alonso, and having briefly gone fastest of all. That, though, would be about as good as it would get. Like the end of Star Trek Nemesis, there was very little data for anyone to work with after the lack of meaningful practice sessions. Strategies, setups and tyre choices went out their respective windows as everyone scrambled to cobble a plan together. In Villeneuve and Renault's instance, the Canadian found his setup had been more ideally tuned to wet weather conditions and was subsequently riddled with understeer. Though he leapt into the points at the start, it didn't take long for a train of cars to gather behind and sail on by. Were it not for a coming together between Barrichello and Coulthard, it would have been an even worse finish than in China, but ended up being a lapped 10th, whilst Alonso was amongst the points once more. Whilst a lack of familiarity with the car was an understandable excuse, most were less understanding when an exhausted Villeneuve openly admitted post-race he was lacking in fitness, particularly on a demanding circuit like Suzuka. Perhaps that went some way to explaining why results were not the only matter lacking for Jacques, as the previous collection of compliments had dried up too, with the only mention of him in the post-race media being Simmons echoing the aforementioned setup issues and Briatore outright ignoring the Canadian. Elsewhere, others headed for the offensive. Fellow ex-champ Alain Prost lambasted his clubmate on French TV. I cannot understand Renault's choice, independently of the fact that he's French. Montagny deserved the experience. Quite how well the better adjusted but inexperienced reserve would have done is a matter for debate. What couldn't be argued was the fact that the gamble on Jacques to help secure second spot in the table had spectacularly backfired. The gap to BAR, rather than closing or even just staying static, had elongated from a 3-point crack to a 16-point chasm within just 2 races. Unless Renault won in Brazil, and with the other car also on the podium, and BAR contrived to have only their second non-scoring Grand Prix all year, the revenge aspect of the comeback was dead and buried. A frustrated Renault were well within their rights to just give up on Villeneuve, but to their credit, they threw everything they could behind their driver to make things work in Brazil. Testing plans were adapted to boot second test driver Heikki Kovalainen out in favour of Jacques to improve both car knowledge and physical conditioning. Arriving in Brazil, the Canadian was as determined as ever. I want to end my time at Renault with a good performance. I definitely want to finish in the points. Trouble was, we'd already heard the same opinion for the last 2 races, so sadly it was unsurprising to see him continue to struggle through practice and qualifying sessions. Not once did he scratch the top 10, and though he openly admitted his qualifying effort was just a bad lap, it had been his worst one yet, leaving him down in 14th. Despite all that, Jacques was still defiantly aiming for points. Luck was needed, and the racing gods supplied somewhat. After all, it wouldn't be a Brazilian Grand Prix without some quantity of liquid dropping from the sky at one point or another. In this instance, it was a steady drizzle, which left F1 strategists with a humdinger of a headache. As every yellow floor sign will tell you, caution, floor slippery when wet. But in this instance, it was light enough that whenever it stopped, the track was likely to dry quickly. Perhaps with the consideration that only a minor miracle could help them overturn BAR, Renault went for the gamble of starting on dry tyres, whilst all others bar one went for the trusted intermediates. The start was damp and the Renaults were doing more slithering than Draco Malfoy. Alonso went from 8th to 15th after a spin, and Villeneuve went backwards, also trapping himself in traffic. But by lap 4 conditions were improving, and Alonso was now fastest of all on track. Soon others were diving into the pits for dry tyres, and Fernando hit the front with Villeneuve in tow, now in the points and matching his teammates' lap times. But as the track fully dried, the Renault pair lost their advantage, and Alonso was left to valiantly defend for his life over 4th place, in what Simmons deemed a masterful drive. Jacques didn't quite hit the same heights, coming home 10th once more, too handicapped from his early delays in the pack. Despite that, it had arguably been his strongest race yet, with the odd flash of promise, such as matching Fernando's pace at points throughout the race, with his fastest lap of the race less than a 10th shy of the Spaniards. Previously, it had been over a second. Jacques did a solid job, said Flavio, possibly through gritted teeth. I don't think his final position reflects his true pace. Villeneuve too was of the opinion, perhaps unsurprisingly, that his performances had gotten better and better from race to race. Sadly, like me waiting until my 30s to watch an animated mouse movie sequel, it was little too late. And solid was not the spectacular that some might have hoped. Jacques' pointless return ranked him lower than the Minardi of Zsolt Baumgartner in the standings, whilst Renault finished well shy of BAR in the constructors. The long-awaited shot at redemption had come and gone. Those 3 races for Renault had been well short of a fairy tale, and the remainder of his F1 days made for some pretty Brothers Grimm reading too. Though he started 4th on his first outing for Sauber, he slumped back to a lapped 13th, and it didn't take long for the knives to pop back out, with rumours of his impending demise emerging within just 4 races. A strong drive to 4th in Imola, ironically after Old Foe's BAR had been disqualified, proved enough of an excuse to keep him on for the remainder of the year. But an ex-world champion barely keeping pace with the still far from finished Felipe Massa was far from what Sauber had been expecting, and he only just clung on to his drive as the team morphed into a BMW Works effort, more owing to his pre-existing contract than any faith the new owners placed upon Jacques. Despite a brace of minor point-scoring positions, all it took was one heavy crash for Villeneuve to provide the Germans with the perfect excuse to turf him out and insert reserve driver Robert Kubica. Painfully, in a rinse and repeat of his BAR departure before, BMW promptly shot up the order into best of the rest status just 12 months later. Maybe that could explain why Jacques, now pushing 40, still continued to desperately try and claw his way back onto the F1 grid one last time. In late 2009, he found himself caught up with the saga of Stefan Grand Prix, an operation whose many attempts to join the F1 circus would make Michael Andretti blush. Owner Zoran Stefanovic had purchased the chassis, gearboxes and engines of the withdrawn Toyota outfit with the hopes of entering the 2010 season. Though it was never officially confirmed, it was strongly rumoured that Villeneuve had signed for Stefan before their prospective entry was denied. The swiftly shelved Toyota TF110 that Jacques would have driven remains widely considered one of the best cars never to race, with a Canadian quoted as saying the numbers looked very good. Incredibly, that still isn't the end of the story, because in July 2010 Villeneuve announced an audacious plan to join forces with junior outfit Durango to form Villeneuve Racing, one of 15 entrants jockeying for a spot on the 2011 grid, and for whom Villeneuve would have been F1's first driver/owner in over 30 years. 2 months later, the FIA announced the team had failed to meet their requirements and were rejected. With that, the long-awaited credits of the Villeneuve vignette finally began to roll. Though the F1 door was now firmly shut, that didn't dampen Villeneuve's racing spirit. From 2007 to 2023, the Canadian has raced in just about every variety of racing series you can possibly name. NASCAR, IndyCar, Rallycross, Formula E, the World Endurance Championship, and many more to boot. His most notable results have been a win at the 1,000 kilometres of Spa, and a pair of wins with the very niche European NASCAR series, as well as a second-place spot at the Le Mans 24 Hours. Whilst his last major race took place in 2023 and he routinely seems to pop up in a punditry position, he seemingly never formally announced his retirement. Perhaps he's waiting to see whether Red Bull fancy taking a gamble on someone else in 2027. That brief little soiree for Renault failed to provide Jacques with any manner of redemption or revenge. But is it fair to just label the whole ordeal under the banner of blundering, bungling bloopers? Yes, it is. In the harshest terms, Villeneuve was brought in to reverse the fortunes of that second car to get some points on the board and secure second place in the Constructors, none of these things happened. Within 4 days of the season concluded, 4 admitted, "I think we made a mistake, we must own up to it. It's unquestionably not been a success." So the question then moves to why was it such an unsuccessful partnership? For starters, we can put that question to Monsieur Faure again, who at the time admitted he, Briatore and Villeneuve had greatly underestimated the effects of such a long layoff. He needs a few more months of competition to find top gear. He is the first to admit it. It's a viewpoint mimicked by Peter Sauber, who felt it all went pretty much exactly as he anticipated. It's only normal that a Formula 1 driver, after a year of absence and in a new team, needs a certain number of kilometres both in test and race conditions before he's able to deliver his full performance. Not for the first time and never for the last, let's drag this video kicking and screaming across to another previously discussed topic, the Ferrari fiascos of Luca Badoer. The Italian greatly struggled to get up to speed during his brief outings, and most were happy to point out the near decade-long gap between successive Grand Prix starts as the reason he floundered. It's a conclusion he heartily disagrees with. "I was 10 months without driving. This is the thing I suffered more from, not the 10 years without racing." It should never be understated how hard it is to return to something like F1 after an extended period away. In that same interview, Badoer goes on to discuss the tricky double bind of such a situation. You need miles in the car to get comfortable in order to push and produce the performance. Thus, you are forced to take a step back from the absolute limit. You can't afford to damage the car and waste time. But with that comes a drop in performance. In order to be fast, you have to take risks, and thus the same quandary goes round and around. Though Signore Badoer insists that it was the lack of driving, not racing, that hindered him most, you have to assume that in that and this instance, a significant time away from any form of wheel-to-wheel combat would have dulled those racing senses. Take a gander at Jacques' old teammate Zonta, another who had graced the Super Sub squad of 2004. The Brazilian had 4,500 testing laps under his belt that year, but had also been out of a full-time racing gig for the best part of a year and a half. For all his recent F1 mileage, to quote F1 rejects, the lack of regular racing had taken the edge off him. Worse still for Jacques, race rustiness and F1 unfamiliarity would have been exemplified by how different his old stomping ground had become within his time away. On the surface, you would say not much had altered. There were no big regulation changes that transformed the cars, no rule manipulation that changed the sport. Instead, it was a lack of change that proved a killer, as static regulations pushed F1 to possibly its fastest ever era, as F1 boffins locked in on maximising their packages. It was the height of the great tyre war between Bridgestone and Michelin, who were pushing each other to create increasingly grippy, durable tyres to a range where cornering speeds were verging on outrageous. Add to that factors like refuelling in races, advanced traction control, unlimited testing, and the result was cars now coming as much as 4 seconds a lap faster at certain circuits compared to the previous year. It was a lot to adjust to, as Jacques reflected after his racing return in China, noting how much the race profile had changed. Before, the race pace used to be fairly slow at the beginning and then increase. Now it is a lot faster from the very first lap, and that just caught me out. Perhaps nothing would have caught Jacques out more than that Renault R24 though. On face value, a race-winning car, but one that had arguably peaked far too early and had been swallowed up by others as their development knocked up a notch, and Renault's did not helped by the smallest budget of the top teams, nor with several staff leaving the project. Not to mention, it was not the most pleasant of cars to drive. After the 2003 Renault model had found its weakest component to be the lack of power produced by the large block of metal located at the car rear, tweaks were made to correct that, but those improvements came at the expense of both aerodynamic and chassis balance, ironically one of the stronger suits of last year's car. Both Alonso and Trulli decreed the R24's handling as difficult, with the Italian going so far as to recall how it would betray him when it was pushed to the limit. I suppose the topic of Trulli and betrayal leads us neatly onto another factor to consider. Whether it was Benetton or Renault, so long as Briatore has stomped those halls, there has always been a touch of a hoodoo around the second endstone seat. For every Schumacher or Alonso who has sat in one, there has been a JJ Leto, Fisichella or Nelson Piquet Jr. in the other. promising talents made to look anything from just ordinary to utterly woeful. Trulli was not the first nor the last to debate whether those two cars were on equal footing. For what it's worth, Briatore, perhaps obviously, denies any such a notion, though of course we should also point out that this is the same man who has denied any involvement within F1's infamous Crashgate scandal, so, there's a scope to take anything the man says with a fair pinch of salt. To sum it all up succinctly, a difficult, possibly unfavoured car that he had barely driven, after a year of no racing and drastically different tyres and speeds, and on top of that, as we've pointed out, no shortage of difficult circumstances. Not once did he have a normal weekend at the wheel, from the new track in Shanghai to the cancelled Saturday of Suzuka to the wet start on slicks in Sao Paulo. It all makes a compelling case for quite why things didn't work out. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances, but not an unavoidable one. Undoubtedly, spending the best part of a year away from F1 and from racing was a big component to Villeneuve's struggles, but it was mostly a self-inflicted problem. In April, Pollock declared that Jacques had been presented offers to drive in 2004, presumably within the midfield or lower within other categories, but they were declined. Villeneuve was, to quote his manager, only prepared to race for someone who would give him a chance of fighting Schumacher for the title. And simply put, that was never on the cards, given the state of his reputation by that point. Instead, he spent a year on the sidelines preparing himself for a comeback, and seemingly didn't even do that correctly. Despite his self-belief after his first test outing and Pollock telling the media his man was fitter than ever, Jacques confessed after China that the race had been a physical struggle, and post-Japan he had admitted that despite his efforts he simply hadn't prepared well enough, neither physically or mentally. You could argue the drastic changes in speed between 03 and 04 caught him unawares, but such differences had been clearly demonstrated since the winter of 2003. None of the above is relevant if we hone in on an option that most would have hammered away down in the comments from the second the opening credits begun. The problem was not the choices Villeneuve made, but the person he was. That by this point in his career, time had simply caught up to the ex-champ, and he simply didn't have the ability to match the performances of his former self. Maybe you can forget how to ride a bike. Worse still, maybe you never knew how, but just did a very good job convincing everyone otherwise. There are arguments to be made that Jacques Villeneuve was never that good, that his initial exploits and achievements were due to fortunate circumstances that made him look better than he actually was. His dazzling debut was in a Williams light years ahead of anyone else, and he enjoyed a similar advantage the following year, and a car fully designed around him, most notably taking pole at this season opener by over 2 seconds from the next non-Williams car. Granted, Williams' development would slow to a crawl that year as they transferred all focus to the 98 car to mitigate the losses of Renault and Adrian Newey, but that can't excuse early season crashes whilst they still had that initial advantage. As old boss Head has quipped, he made bloody hard work of winning that championship. If that's the case, then you're left with a distinctly ordinary F1 career. Of course, there is judgment passed in hindsight, looking for an angle to justify why the remainder of his time in F1 would prove so barren. For argument's sake, Villeneuve may well have been as brilliant as he first appeared, and but for that BAR blunder, might have gone on to bigger and better things. Richards has reflected just after Jacques parted ways with him, he is and always will be one of the great icons of the sport. But it's been a terrible few years for him. It really has knocked the stuffing out of him. I believe the talent is still there. Maybe if JV had switched to a Ferrari, McLaren, or even early exit to Enstone, this whole thing would have read as quite the different tale. It's not a reflection our protagonist makes. I probably could have made different decisions that could have meant more championships, but I could also have killed myself with a different team. You just don't know. We've covered our fair share of stories on this channel. Most will contain an enormous crash, the heartbreaking bang of an engine, or some manner of dramatic occurrence. It leads us to ponder and peruse the data to see what could have been, to debate until the cows come home over just how that might have shifted reality into something else. On face value, this isn't one of those tales. To a passerby or a casual observer, it is nothing more than 3 mediocre outings from a substitute driver. About as noteworthy as when Robert Dornbos drove for Red Bull or Nicolas Chiesa at Minardi. Those are names that mean nothing to those outside of the most dedicated in the F1 fan base, and I suppose that just illustrates my point further on how nondescript this brief moment in F1 history seemingly was. On this occasion, we may not be able to construct any sort of argument over one last hurrah, one last flick of the V's to the doubters and to the haters. Indeed, all we have left to wonder is how nice it might have been to see Jacques Villeneuve, polarising a player he may be, get to ride that bike one last time. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.